Started then? Is that okay? All right.
Yay.
Thanks everyone for powering through our pain. So I'll go ahead and get started again. Welcome to our first ever, as you can tell, Kubernetes office hours. What this is going to be is a live stream of us having developers here, kind of like a radio show, and then you, the users, will ask questions both in Slack or on YouTube, and we'll do our best to answer them. And if we can't answer them, we'll do our best to try to either help you find a way to debug, or maybe next time get you an expert that can help you, or that kind of thing. So the point is to try to get you a place to go. So with that, let me do some quick introductions of those of us that are here today. I'm George Castro, and I'm here to help facilitate answering your questions and paying attention on Twitter and that sort of thing. You want to go next?
Sure. I'm Ilya Dmitrichenko from VWorks, and I'm a co-host here. Also here to help with all sorts of questions, starting from anything related to cluster lifecycle, kubeadm, etc., as well as networking and stuff like continuous delivery, etc.
Andy, you want to go next?
Sure, I'm Andy Goldstein. I'm at Heptio with George, and I've been doing a lot of work on API machinery, and at times I've dipped my fingers into the kubelet as well, and kube control, so kind of most things. Not so much a networking expert. I know we have a question about that, but we'll try to help.
Clayton, are you there? I haven't heard you yet this morning, so.
Yeah, this is Clayton. My name's Clayton Coleman. I work on kind of a lot of different things, API machinery and kube control and little odds and ends of the code base. And I can, if there's questions along the lines of random stuff, I can usually find someone who can help answer as well.
Okay, I'll go next. Priya Basi from Transform in Germany. I'm mainly concerned with security these days at this security benchmark, and can answer questions around on-prem and AWS setups, I guess.
All right, let's get started. So first things first, let me give you the quick mission statement of what we're trying to do here. So the idea is that we would make a starting monthly, and we'll do more depending on what the demand is. So the idea is to give users a place where they can talk to developers and ask them questions, right? And on the other hand, it's a place to give developers to get more feedback from users that are using their code. So the intent there is to kind of make it so, hey, I'm trying to use this. Can you give me a hand? And then we can figure out things. Like, for example, if we have a new feature that gets added in a certain release, and then the next week we find out that we're flooded with a bunch of questions, maybe we need to investigate like how we're explaining that feature to people in the docs or something like that. So the idea there is to tighten the feedback loop. And if you're using Kubernetes, or you're an operator or a developer that's using it, maybe you're using it at work, the idea here is to help introduce you to each other, first of all, which is always a lot of fun. We know Kubernetes-users has a lot of people in it, right? And sometimes you just need to find a person that's stuck in the same way you are. So the idea there is to make this useful for you to learn things like that, right? Like, we want it so that if you're sitting at work and your boss is like, hey, let's have a fun activity, maybe you pop this on the TV or something and learn a little bit about Kubernetes. So stuff like that. We are also writing everything down on what it takes to make one of these. So if you want to do one of these locally or regionally, for this first one, we chose the European time zone. The next one, we want to do something closer to the West Coast of the US. We want to equip the community with the tools that they need in order to pull this off. And these first few ones are going to be a little bit rough, like with YouTube URLs and things like that. So the idea is for us to kind of shake out the methodology that we're using to, figure out what it takes to run one of these well, and then kind of go from there. There are going to be a few ground rules, though, before we start. Those of you in the channel, in hash office hours, we do have a few rules. The first is no judgment zone. So I'm learning how to use Kubernetes myself, and there's nothing more frustrating than when you get starting working on something and you ask a question and then somebody makes fun of you for using it wrong or whatever. So let's keep things positive. There are certainly a lot of things that can go wrong when doing distributed systems. So we need to kind of understand where people are coming from. Some people don't have, they might have different networking restrictions at work than you might have, things like that. So let's try to keep it constructive and try to help people as much as we can. What's on topic and what's off topic? So with the complexity of these systems, some of these questions will just be unanswerable, right? Like Clayton can't just SSH to your work machine and figure it out for you. So for a lot of these questions, depending on how complex they are, we might end up just having to explain to you how to start the debugging process to help you get to where you need to be. So for example, networking, I know networking questions are just going to end up being complicated due to their nature. So what we're going to try to do there is if something is too complex, too local to your specific installation, is to kind of help you find the place in the docs where you need to go, or what SIG you need to join to follow along, or to kind of figure out the process of how you need to get started to figure out what exactly is the problem, right? And that might be things from, hey, have you checked this log, to, hey, check IP tables, right? I mean, a checklist of common sense things to check will probably start to get you going down the right path. Everything else is pretty much on topic. We'd like to avoid you asking questions that are easily Googleable. So for example, what's a pod? Probably not a best use of everyone's time, but someone asking, hey, why was the pod chosen, as like the basic unit block, kind of explain to me the onus behind pods, right? That's a much better, much answerable question. So with that, we'll get started as soon as Liz introduces herself. Welcome.
I was going to mention, I'll check the stream as it goes live now, and it's Clayton's avatar that we're seeing right now.
Oh, okay. All right, I've got it set to whoever's talking, so.
All right.
And I'll crank up my volume. Thanks for the feedback, everybody. Is Liz muted?
She's not muted, but we can't hear her. Maybe restart Chrome. It's the restart Chrome bug in Hangouts, maybe. I have that sometimes.
All right. And she just decided to bail instead. Just kidding. She has technical problems. We'll come back to her.
Okay.
No worries. All right. Do we want to start with our first question then?
Sure.
And someone can let me know how my audio sounds now. That'd be great. Okay, so Tamal asks, question. I am trying to use my custom out-of-tree cloud provider with Kubernetes. I'm able to run it thanks to help from Lucas. But I notice a kubelet calls APIs like node address by provider with empty provider ID for external cloud provider. Digging in the code for the 1.7 branch, I see that the kubelet cloud is null for external cloud providers. As a result, get instance provider ID returns an empty string. His questions are, and that's in the Slack channel. If you could repost that again, Tamal, that'd be great, so people can actually read the functions you're calling. His questions are, what features are lacking from out-of-tree cloud providers as a result of this? And is this intentional or a temporary thing that will be fixed in the future?
So I took a look at the code real quick. I will say I have not looked at this before, so take this kind of with a little bit of a grain of salt. But I believe that there are some things like labeling the node's instance type won't happen. And it looks like the node's addresses, which go into the status, so node.status.addresses would not be updated as well. So I imagine we probably need that. And I would say it probably needs a little bit more investigation. Clayton, what do you think?
Yeah, for the first thing, labeling, that's actually a really good point. There's actually been some security discussions about how, in general, that's something that's better to move to the central controller, because the central controller has access to most of the same information that the node would on almost all cloud providers anyway. And it means that, for instance, a node couldn't lie about what labels it has. So I wouldn't be surprised to see that one move to, that responsibility move to the cloud provider in the next release or so. The second one definitely is going to be much harder. I actually don't know that someone's considered that yet.
You're muted, Andy, if you were going to have a response.
I wasn't, but I guess I
okay.
would say there probably would be some unexpected behavior with the current state of the code using an external cloud provider.
Mm-hmm. And
this is definitely a great example of not everything that happens in the SIG in the SIGs working on things like moving the external cloud provider out makes it to the rest of the team of the docs, but talking with the SIG responsible for cloud controller and opening a bug, documenting your experiences. This is actually an example of something where it's possible that someone building their own custom cloud controller has a fair amount of experience that's relevant to the SIG that's doing the design for this.
Yeah, and Clayton, just to clarify here, this is the cloud node controller, which I hadn't seen before, but that's what I'm looking at.
Yeah, but maybe adding in general, there is plans, if I remember correctly, that we move cloud providers out of the main release and just have that external by default. So this might help. But it's far future, I would say.
Is there an overarching SIG for cloud providers, or like where's the best place to find out?
Well, so we've been having a discussion on the developer mailing list. It hasn't been active in a couple of weeks, but there was a question as to whether we should have something like SIG Cloud that would have cross-cutting concerns that applied to anybody who wanted to implement a cloud provider for Kubernetes. And I believe there was lazy consensus to go ahead and do that, but I'd have to go back and check what the final state was, or what the last state was there. But at this point, I'd say probably SIG architecture is the best place to take it until we can get SIG Cloud up and running, assuming that happens.
Yeah, and I've been using SIG architecture as my answer to a lot of questions lately. Usually anything that's crossing a bunch of SIGs and kind of you don't know exactly where it goes, it doesn't hurt to bounce things off of SIG architecture. And in the Slack channel, I'm going to post a link to the list of SIGs there for the users who haven't seen this yet. Kubernetes is kind of broken up and the work is done by special interest groups, SIGs as we call them. And different parts of the code base will eventually be owned by SIGs. Kind of there's like general spheres of what those SIGs are responsible for. So generally speaking, all SIGs have public open meetings that are just like this, except anyone could just come hang out. So usually what I find is the hard part finding out when I have a problem is what SIG covers it exactly, unless you know for sure what tool you're using. So I use this list a lot of SIGs to kind of figure out, okay, when's the next time SIG network is meeting? And sometimes I'll just show up and listen in. And just about all of those, if you go to that page, they have Slack channels and they have playlists of all their meetings on YouTube and things like that. So it's a great resource. Liz, do you have audio yet?
Let's find out. Do I?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
You do. Awesome.
Hello. So I'll quickly introduce myself. I'm Liz Rice. I am a technology evangelist with Aqua Security. And yeah, I'm not somebody who has dug a whole lot into the inner workings of Kubernetes, but maybe somebody can come from the outside of somebody who's tried to use it to demonstrate various things. And I know a reasonable amount about containers and runtimes and that side of things. And I think I was thinking this list of SIGs is a really good point. As somebody who's just trying to get involved more with Kubernetes, I'm going to just echo that it is quite hard to know where to ask.
Yeah.
Trying to figure out whether your question even relates to apps or auth or auto scaling, or some of those, even the concepts are quite hard. So if people out there are thinking, but I don't even know where to start, you are not alone.
Yeah, I think my first 6 months I just put it as like right on my bookmarks toolbar, and I hit it 3 or 4 times a day. I'm constantly going in there. Okay, who do I need to talk to over here? And then they all keep very, very copious notes. So, once you get in there and you click on their respective page, they all maintain who runs that SIG, where the notes are. So all the notes are public. And usually I can be like, okay, I don't know what API machinery's been up to, but I can click on their link and see their last 3 meetings and kind of glom, get a TLDR executive version of what I need. So that's very, very handy for me. Awesome. Are we ready for another question here? Let me see here. So are we ready to tackle the Stack Overflow question, Andy? Or at least kind of give it a shot? I'm going to go ahead and repaste that one in the Slack channel. I'm
going to defer to somebody else on that one. That's beyond my level of networking expertise, other than do whatever you need to do to debug channel and IP tables and whatever else. But I am not an expert in that, so I need to punt on that one.
Yeah, that one seems like a complex one, so I'm either going to have to grab an expert for our next one, or Ilya, I don't know if you were
let me just familiarize myself very briefly with what's going on here.
Sure.
So node port service is unreachable by IP only on 2 out of 4 slaves in the cluster. All right. Okay, so I can see that they are using Flannel, and there's firewall D involved. They disabled firewall D on master. So it's a 5 VM cluster, 1 master and 4 slaves running Ubuntu. Oh, right. Does Ubuntu ship firewall D? I thought that was a CentOS thing. I guess latent does. And then exposed by node port service from complicated volume. As I understood from Kate's service doc, the type node port exposes the service or null nodes in the cluster. However, when I created it, the service was exposed only on 2 nodes out of 4 in the cluster. I am guessing that's not expected behavior, right? Troubleshooting. Okay, let me see if they got. So it sounds like it is possible that this is as simple as kube proxies and running on all the nodes. I mean, that's like a proxy. Okay, so no,
yeah, they need to have kube proxy running on all the nodes, and IP tables needs to be set up identically. And the comment did mention that IP tables -L look the same, but I think what's critical to look at is IP tables -T nat -L to look at the NAT table inside of IP tables, because that's where you'll find all the routing for services.
Yeah, that's right.
Looking at the debugging, it seems those 2 nodes don't have access to the node network, to the container network at all. Like even pinging the container directly or the pod directly doesn't work.
Well, I wouldn't expect pinging to work.
Curling. I mean, it works from the other nodes. So.
Yeah, it sounds like a hairy issue, to be honest. So they've used kubeadm, right? And they installed Flannel. Okay. As you might have guessed, I'm no expert in Flannel. Yeah, it's not quite clear from this. It seems like, so if I search for kube proxy in this question, it seems like they use netstat, and netstat sort of bubbles up that kube proxy is running in all those nodes. And then they're trying to telnet localhost. Okay, and that's not working on the 2 nodes at the bottom. Well, kube proxy is supposed to be listening. Okay. Right.
if anybody has any Stack Overflow points and wants to go ahead and tack a bounty on this or tweet it or maybe help spread the word, we could at least maybe grab all the expertise of the people that are listening. And then I'll toss it in the show notes and see if we can get this person some help. Because it seems to be strange that Kubeadmin would have nodes coming up that work and ones that don't work. Like assuming you didn't touch them by hand, right? But we
we can start with bounties. I haven't started a bounty, but I'm happy to do this. I'll just go and do that.
Okay, and I'll go ahead and move on to our next question.
Yeah.
Amo Holland asks, is there a way to visualize the traffic that comes in and out of a Kubernetes cluster? Response times, if any traffic is lost, etc.
Generally, well, first, I guess I'm wondering if this is about traffic that's going to services and pods or talking to the API server itself. I'm going to assume this is maybe ingress into pods and back. I'm not aware of anything out of the box that can do that, but there's probably some sort of monitoring stuff that you could add on. I'm just not familiar with that right now.
Well, I must mention that with Weavescope, you can start looking at some of those things. You could see what's going where, but we don't track lost packets as such, right? However, one could implement a scope plugin to track lost packets.
Yeah, most of the tools I've seen are just more inside the components of the cluster, not necessarily.
I mean, depending on the ingress controller you're running, if you have an Nginx ingress controller, there should be tooling for Nginx to visualize your traffic there. Or if you're on a cloud, an ELB traffic monitoring tool should work.
Yeah, so we have done something in Scope, actually, now that I think of it. We have a traffic control plugin in Scope, but that's like more about, making your application, cutting the bandwidth into your app, right? Wherever that's coming from outside the cluster or from within. So I should definitely, it sounds like, Weavescope does come close to this. It may be not the complete solution to the particular problem in mind. But additionally, I think if we are considering, response times and such things, perhaps instrumenting your apps with Prometheus or actually putting Prometheus exporters in front of your apps, they'll be able to do that. It would be one way to do it, right?
I was going to ask, is this kind of part of the cloud native mantra that everyone keeps talking about, where it's like, hey, what you should really be doing is instrumenting your apps with these tools available to kind of modernize them, to allow them to be instrumented in this manner?
Yeah, because it becomes really hard when you, for example, consider HTTPS traffic. You can have all sorts of fancy DPI gear, right? But DPI, there's probably a way to get DPI into your TLS channels, but that may be still quite hard and a lot to ask, right? It actually becomes much easier if you consider instrumenting apps with Prometheus or implementing a Prometheus exporter if you can't instrument an app directly.
Okay. Any other comments before we move to the next question? All right, this next one's from Brad Beam. Sorry, I missed your question. He had one earlier. If I missed your question, please repost it. I won't get mad. Question: are there any plans to replace Heapster with Prometheus for things like horizontal pod autoscaler and the dashboard?
So I can talk a little bit to this. There's been a long arc being worked on through SIG instrumentation and SIG autoscaling to streamline Heapster, to slim it down into what you may have heard called the metric server, to offer a limited set of metrics for the metrics that the cluster needs in a very simple form. So things that the scheduler could use to make better decisions about where to place pods. So if you search for metric server in the Kubernetes incubator or follow along with SIG instrumentation, there's work ongoing for that. the goal is to also be able to integrate Prometheus and other metric solutions to get additional data. I think the initial plan for the dashboard was to take their existing Heapster integration, and they're still looking at a number of options with the dashboard, to the best of my knowledge, and I may be slightly out of date here, where when the new metrics server, which is just a slimmed down Heapster, takes over, there'll be a new metrics API, and the dashboard will use that. That will lose some fidelity from the existing graphing because the new Heapster, the new metrics server won't store quite as much metrics data. And I've heard people discussing actively doing some light integration in the dashboard with one or more metric solutions. I don't think it's quite decided yet.
Okay, great. And that brings in another quick topic. If you go on github.com/Kubernetes-incubator, there's tons of good stuff in there that people are working on. So you definitely want to check that out. I hope that answers your question, Brad.
Maybe another general thing around these things, as we're talking a lot about roadmap and upcoming things, do we have a place where these like plans and roadmaps get published? Because I know there was a monitoring 2.0 roadmap that includes these things that we talked about.
Yeah, so the way that we've been doing things up to date is there is a GitHub repository called Kubernetes/features. And inside that repository, anyone is free to create an issue to propose something that would be a feature that would be potentially added to Kubernetes at some point. And typically they will be alongside a proposal, which often starts as a Google Doc and ultimately most likely ends up getting converted to Markdown and committed to that GitHub repository. And then assuming that the at least one SIG agrees to go forth with whatever the feature is, then we'll have steps for going from nothing to alpha to beta to GA. But we do have that repository to track possible features and ones that are in flight.
Mm-hmm. Also,
and many SIGs do carry roadmaps of their own. They're not quite standardized, I think, to the level that would be useful. And there's been a lot of discussion recently about getting a little bit more formal with how we propose and track the deeper details of how these things should work across multiple releases. So it's getting better, I'll say that.
Yeah, and that gives me an opportunity to mention that on every Thursday there's a community meeting where SIGs kind of rotate in and out, giving us a status report of what's happening. And SIG PM and SIG architecture also usually have status reports that kind of tell you what's going on holistically across the project. So I'll make sure I paste a link to that in the show notes of when that is. That's on every Thursday. So moving on to our next question. We have Sellers, Chris Sellers. Awesome. Thanks for coming, Chris. Question. We are using Kops for deployment management into AWS and are trying to leverage OAuth from our Google suite to grant roles and bindings to users of kube control and eventually to an ingress controller to the dashboard via the API server. We have email claims working well for authorization, but are trying to do division of privilege to assigned roles based on group memberships. My specific question is, does Google OAuth support passing group as part of the claim? If so, where can I get docs on how to get that in the claim? And is the API server ready to support getting groups to do role binding assignments?
So I can at least answer the last part. So the API server does support groups being passed along at authorization time. I believe the current mechanisms for Google Auth I'm a little bit less familiar with, and so I'd have to defer that part of the question. It should be easy to find, but the intent would always be that if the authorization or the authentication provider for Kubernetes has the ability to pass groups along, RBAC is already ready for that in Kubernetes. And I'll defer the other parts of the question to some folks who may have looked at Google Auth more recently than I.
And it looks like we don't have anybody else familiar with Google Auth. So Chris, we'll go ahead and table that, and then hopefully I'll be able to snag someone who can help you answer the first part of your question. But hopefully that'll get you started down the right road. Next question from ABD4LLA. Sorry, I can't pronounce that, if that's supposed to be pronounced. What is the recommended way for exposing an edge service? When you have an edge service such as Netflix Zool, that is the entry point to a set of services. I find it confusing whether to expose that edge service via a service object with a load balancer, ELB in this case, or via an ingress. Specifically, that I don't need the URL-based reverse proxy capabilities of ingress, since that is done in the edge service itself.
I can take that maybe. If you go with very few edge services, and Zool lets us point to that, then I would most probably go with an ELB, because ingress just adds another point of failure that you need to manage. And as you said, you don't need the functionality that ingress gives you. If you have a lot of those edge services, then ingress could help you, because you can manage them with ingress rules inside your cluster instead of having to manage a lot of ELBs outside, which are also not perfect always.
Okay, and please do a follow-up if your question has changed based on his response or not, and then we'll get to it. In the meantime, keep the questions coming, guys. These are great. Let's see who's next. Question from Itamaro. In a mixed prod dev GKE cluster with prod services exposed publicly using GCLB ingress, how can you make dev services both HTTP and non-HTTP accessible to developers from our laptops outside the cluster without exposing such services externally?
I would most probably go with kubectl proxy there, and then go over the proxy to directly to the services or endpoints that you can use. So I can find out the commands for you.
And there's also the possibility too that, just like kube control proxy and kube control port forward, but you may also want to run a proxy inside of Kubernetes and have that be the only thing you expose. I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, there's something that does have to be exposed. But for instance, I've seen people expose SSH servers that offer the ability to port forward a little bit more at a lower grained or a more fine-grained level than what the API server allows.
Okay, and hopefully that'll get you started there. Please post a follow-up question tomorrow if you're looking for more detail on that one. Let's see, did I miss one? That's pretty much all the questions so far. Anybody else have more questions?
Do we have more questions on YouTube?
Yeah, I'm looking there. I've got my head on a swivel on every single channel I'm monitoring.
Yeah, so it's unfortunate that the wrong URL still has 21 faults on it. Where are we at with? Let me check my phone. Phone doesn't. Well, on Android you don't get the chart. Does it seem like?
Yeah.
I'll have to pick that up.
Let me see if I can work on that. If when someone asks the next question, I will go and do another round of corralling people up. Here we go. Another one. Question: what is the recommended way to have a pod affinity to a node that has some custom kernel flags?
I think the answer is fairly simple. It's with you do that with a node selector, right?
You could use node selector, assuming you know what the node's labels are. You could also potentially do taints and tolerations to try and accomplish that too.
Yeah, and there is also a thing that the folks at Intel worked on, right? Node feature discovery add-on. that sort of like adds extra labels for various features of Intel CPUs. And we're talking about CPU flags or kernel flags, right? Okay, so you'd probably want to manually add those. I don't know if node feature discovery is actually going to do this. I thought it was more about CPU features. However, I'm not wrong.
Yeah, but in general, labels shouldn't be an anti-pattern. There's the current use of that.
I don't think taints are a thing for this. Taints are kind of, with a taint you could say, like, if you were to say that I want this pod to also run on nodes that have such and such taints.
It taints you could reserve the node, maybe.
Yeah.
And also, taints give you a little bit more control. So if you want the option to prefer to schedule onto that or to halt if no kernel flag is available, some of these things are things that taints are explicitly designed to give you more flexibility on, even if they're not always you may not always need that complexity, as Ilya was saying.
Right, you would have soft and hard affinity there, or soft and hard selection.
Yeah, that is, yeah. So let's explain that. Yeah, please do let us know if this answers your question.
Mm-hmm. We have two more questions being typed by some of our listeners. We currently have 51 people watching the live stream in addition to the Slack people. So thank you very much, everyone, for showing up.
Yeah, there are more people showing up. That's all.
Sure.
So that's what I said. That's a good thing. That, if you do have a question, you don't have to hang out for the whole hour.
Yeah, and thanks, Andy, for going back to the old YouTube and making sure that people are moving over here. I've got a question from Puppix TV. How will we go about creating scheduled requests with Kubernetes like it happens in GAE with the cron.yaml file?
Where are you reading that from?
That's in the YouTube.
That's on YouTube.
Yeah.
That doesn't sound like,
Yeah. So it sounds like he's just trying to schedule a cron job, the equivalent of a cron job in Kubernetes.
Right. Yeah, of course. Right. Yeah. I mean, there are cron jobs, right?
Yeah. So, can you explain more generally what that is? I had been using Kubernetes for a while now. I didn't even know that those existed.
Yeah, so there are cron jobs in Kubernetes, but the API only recently, I think within the past week, graduated from alpha to beta. So if you were looking to use it on something like GKE, I don't believe that would be enabled, given that the most recent stable release running on GKE would have it in alpha, and they don't enable alpha APIs. But if you do have access or the ability to control which APIs are running, or you're running on master, the API is beta now, or you could enable the alpha one and then use it. And it uses a standard cron selector, and you would specify basically what you'd want it to run, just like you're running a pod, but it ends up being scheduled via cron.
Yeah, and it's definitely worth being aware too that
was that me or he just cut out?
He cut out.
Okay.
Yep.
I'll fill in with more information from the asker. If the autoscaler kicks in, I wouldn't want to have all containers send the same request multiple times.
So I think with the cron job, it'll only get scheduled once, right?
Yeah, or does he want it to run on each node once? I'm not sure about the autoscaler context there.
Yeah, Puppix TV, if you could clarify if you just want everything run on each node once, or is it one of those if they miss it when they get autoscaled, then what happens? Like,
is Autoscaler like at all related to cron jobs. Maybe there's a misconception there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is not.
The idea of cron job seems like, it will run once. It wouldn't be a subject to Autoscaler.
Yeah, I'm wondering if this is something that's GAE specific, maybe.
Right. Maybe, yeah. Does cron job even have a scale attribute?
No.
Yeah.
That is why I thought it's maybe cluster autoscaler and something that needs to run on each node or on all nodes.
Well, they want like a daemon set cron job style thing.
Yeah.
Okay. Huh.
I don't know. It's,
Okay.
There's definitely been things like daemon set cron jobs suggested. I think if most of the challenges have been coming up with use cases that really require it, and most people have been able to work around it in other ways. So I would say if you've tried to use cron jobs to accomplish a task and you don't feel they quite fit, please do give that feedback. I think one of the most important things in Kubernetes is that people are able to give feedback on their use cases they have, just like you guys are doing right now, into the SIGs, who can take that and turn that into plans for the future.
Mm-hmm. And it ends up that he or she is on GKE, so cron jobs are not available to them yet. But what did you say, is that beta in 1.7 or in 1.8?
1.7.
Okay, all right.
So if they upgrade to 1.7, that should be available as far as I know.
I'm pretty sure it just recently graduated to beta.
Okay.
Because I just tried kubectl get cron job against my GT 172 plus actually 173, and that seems to have failed.
Sure.
Yeah, I'm fairly confident it was like within the last week, which means it'll be in 1.8.
Okay.
And
It does seem to have jobs though.
And before we move on to the next question, can you guys really quick run through what we mean by alpha, beta, and production? Like when somebody
Sure.
tells, like, is it, and how that ties into our release cycle and whatnot.
So we call APIs alpha, beta, and GA or stable, whatever you want to call it, based on how we feel they are about their quality and also in terms of their stability. So an alpha API is something that is proposed, and we reserve the right to rename fields, rename types, and there's no forwards or backwards compatibility guarantees with an alpha API. So they're alpha to allow the development team to iterate on their implementation, and they may change over time. When an API graduates to beta, that means that we're going to do everything in our power to retain compatibility as you would go forward with newer versions of Kubernetes. And we don't want to rename fields and rename types and things like that. And then when you get to something that's V1 or V2 or any of the stable API versions, then we are not allowed to make breaking changes. And there is not a direct correlation between an alpha API or a beta API and a Kubernetes version, other than within a given Kubernetes release, like 1.7, some APIs will be alpha, some will be beta, and some will be stable. And then as you progress to newer Kubernetes releases, presumably the alpha ones will advance to beta and to stable and so on.
Yeah, that was kind of the comment I was hoping to tease out of you is, you have a specific Kubernetes version, and certain parts of those will be, very stable things, but there will also be sets of APIs and whatnot that might be considered alpha or beta. So that's just something that I wasn't expecting when I first joined. I was like, hey, oh, neat. So, all right, moving on to our next question.
Actually, I have a follow-on question from that alpha beta question.
Sure.
So what do people generally do with their existing YAML files where they potentially specify, V1, beta 1, or what have you? Do people have to go through and update their YAML files manually when the APIs move on?
Often they do. Sometimes we have migrations, like when we renamed scheduled jobs to cron jobs, I think.
And
oftentimes.
The kube control convert command. If you have an object in one version of the API, kube control convert will convert it to another. And as we were saying, not all objects always go from alpha to beta and have a conversion path, but we generally try to do so in order to get that feedback of ensuring people are trying cron jobs as much as possible. We just can't promise it.
Yeah. And like in some cases, like something that was an annotation does get converted into real attributes, right? Like the tolerations annotations were converted from alpha to beta as attributes. And
yes, and we actually have been having a big discussion about how we're going to do alpha fields and alpha features, and if there are going to be annotations going forward or not. And I believe the latest guidance, and I'll go find a link and drop it into Slack, but I believe the latest guidance is we are not going to be doing annotations anymore because it just makes too many issues for moving forward as you progress to different API versions. So rather than doing annotations, we'll be just doing field names like you would expect to see.
Okay, so yeah, annotations are like no longer recommended for most of the cases, right?
For things that are like API behaviors, like paints, tolerations, etc. Yeah, going forward, we're not going to do those as annotations. I'm fairly certain.
So there would be like alpha fields that may change.
Yes, and they would be enabled or disabled using a feature gate. And I'll send the link in Slack in a minute, and you can read up on it. It has all the details.
Yeah, that's pretty meaningful. Also, because like annotation, some JSON and annotation, it's something that is like pretty hard to validate, right? It's kind of like as a user to get to see whether what you've done is like meaningful at all or not. It's kind of hard because you may have misspelled the key, and if you misspelled the key, you just ignore it.
Mm.
And the keys are pretty long sometimes. Right?
Okay.
Cool. That's nice to hear.
Moving on. Question from Chris Mill 46. How do I preserve InfluxDB when Kubernetes moves the pod to another node?
Ooh.
That sounds like you need persistent volumes and stateful sets.
But
or you want to have a good clustering where you use local storage for it.
Mm-hmm. So hopefully that answers your question. Post a follow-up. This next one from Ovin Doe. I'm trying to get through as many of these as possible. I don't know what anybody here has any hard time limits at the top of the hour, but trying to get in as many of these as we can. I'm currently using the standard Nginx ingress resource with kubelego to handle Let's Encrypt certificates. The ingress is backed by a load balance service, specifically Azure. Is it at all possible to get the external client IP through to the internal application ingress plus pod in such a configuration? I can't currently seem to even get it through the Nginx ingress itself. The source IP is listed as 127.0.0.1. Attempted to run with a service beta Kubernetes / external traffic. Only local annotation on the LB service to no avail. Sorry, I kind of butchered that, but it's pasted in the Slack channel.
Mm-hmm. So right, that's basically kubelego and Nginx ingress. I see. Well, from one thing that I know for sure is that Traffic kind of provides very much the same functionality, except it's baked into a single ingress controller and it does the certificates for you and stuff. So that may be worth trying as a test, whether it could work with Traffic. An additional piece of info. I don't think the JetStack folks are here today, but I thought James was about to join, but he maybe didn't make it. And yeah, essentially, I think they are reworking the kubelego stuff into Certificate Manager, which gets merged, which is essentially a merger between kubelego and something else. So there may be some changes there that would cater for this issue.
So I'll say that this is one of the hardest problems in computing, is trying to keep an IP flowing through a whole layer of proxies. So it's possible too that this was just an unintentional bug at some layer because something is proxying something else without passing that forward. since each step in the chain, each proxy in the chain is going to need to do something a little bit different to ensure that that value gets propagated. So it is possible that if for the component that is returning the wrong value, this might actually be a good candidate for a bug, just because I suspect there's some combination of config that's non-obvious.
There might be an annotation on the ingress controller. I can look it up because I remember we had such a case back then.
Mm-hmm. But like ingress annotations are like subject to implementation, right?
Yeah, it's the Nginx ingress controller, so we're running that too. So I can.
I'm not even extremely confident how many of the ingress controllers that are kind of popular that fully implement all the like ingress API. Right?
It further also is dependent on how you set up that load balancer in Azure, because like with ELBs you can set them to just like TCP everything through. I'm not sure how you do it on Azure. There's something like external proxy protocol or something.
Yeah, the proxy protocol would be the first thing I would check for. Maybe controller. You have to make a response again for whatever the next proxy in the chain is.
Clayton, you're breaking up.
Yeah, he got choppy on me there. All right, let's try to get more in here. When using a PVC for dynamic provisioning of volumes in a cloud providers, i.e. EBS and AWS, such volumes become owned by the current cluster, which means the volume lifecycle is tied to the cluster lifecycle. Now, if I need to create a new cluster for some reason, is there a supported way to migrate these volumes to the new cluster?
That is my favorite problem. I think this actually is one of the reasons why I created the issue about well, not this one in particular, right? The same applies to ELBs, right? Oh, he mentioned ELBs already, right? They mentioned yeah. So so cloud providers' resources are kind of like attached to cluster lifecycle, and I think it's pretty legit that you want to manage some of those externally. So the external cloud provider work should hopefully cater for this, in my understanding, right? At least that's why I sort of raised the issue initially, and that's when the external cloud provider work started. I don't know if it caters for it yet, but essentially, I don't know the specifics of PVC. Well, like with an ELB, you can obviously manage that with CloudFormation or Terraform or something like that, and then essentially point it at your cluster, right? So with a PVC, I'm not quite sure how you'd manage that. I haven't had experience with.
You would have to do it manually.
Right.
So you couldn't use a dynamic provisioning.
We're getting an echo from me. If you want to, one of you mute while the other's talking.
Yeah.
Yep, perfect. Okay, and thanks, Daniel.
One thing real quick. We have been working on something that we open sourced a couple weeks ago called Arc from Heptio that will allow you to back up and restore your cluster data, including taking snapshots of persistent volumes, and so you can move them from one cluster to another. It's alpha at this point, and maybe would help you out. So we'd appreciate it if you take a look and give us some feedback.
Yeah, that would be current best practice, I guess, to snapshot and bring it to a new cluster, or to mirror somehow, sync, and then switch DNS on top or so.
Mm-hmm. Moving on, Elric R asks, during the deploy, I have to curl back into a cluster running an Nginx ingress on GCE. How can I give those access to secure cluster without ingress, TLS, etc.? It worked. I can get it to curls to work by passing -k --flag, but feels so wrong. Sorry, I feel like I butchered that question.
Are they hitting Kubernetes API with curl, or is that some service of their own?
So, Elric, if you're listening, are you curling the Kubernetes API itself or your application? That would be good to know then, right? And there is a bit of a stream delay, so we might have to come back to him when he gets us more information, him or her. So next, question, is there a K8 Kubernetes native pattern for shared replication services? A deployment with n shards, each shard knows its ID, and with the ith shard with k_i replicas, possibly depending on load. How can I achieve something that behaves like that, with consuming services dynamically discovering all available shards? Sorry, that question's definitely not easy to read.
That sounds like a brilliant question. I think this would be like ETO 2.0 feature request.
Yeah, I mean, I would say in general, stateful sets are intended to do part of that, because most of the things that need deep sharding are stateful. If you need much more flexibility and you're willing to over provision it a lot, you could certainly set up multiple stateful sets, treating each as a shard, but it's going to require a little bit of automation on your part.
Yeah, perhaps this is sort of edges into the territory of like operators based on like stateful set based operators, right?
Yeah, and
absolutely.
It goes pretty much into sharding logic, which is, I think, outside of the space of Kubernetes.
Yeah, that's why I said it's like Istio 2.0, because this is really on the app layer, and that's where Istio kind of lives, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Next question, what is the easiest way to view resources and use versus limits for a number of pods? And get visibility for which pods are liable for eviction or have been evicted. Kube-controlled top pods shows current usage, but not limits.
Yeah, so kube-controlled top pods was always kind of an alpha. It's an alpha command, if you want to call it that. Right now, you'd have to look at 3 different places. When things are evicted, there is a record kept of that. If you're using a disruption budget, you'll actually get a count of how many things have been evicted under that. So that's one way. Disruption budget's one of those lesser known features that actually provides a lot of value if you want to control how often your pods are kicked off of nodes. When a pod is evicted, there is information written to its status. So that's something that's available via the API. And then in general, today we don't have a command that brings together quota plus requested resource limits as they might be shown on node describe. With the actual usage, once the metrics API graduates, it's very likely that once the metrics API graduates, that we're going to combine those into a single command, whether it's top pod or something similar. It just doesn't exist today.
I was just going to add, like, we have a graphical equivalent of kubectl get top pods in Deepscope also. I don't think it has the functionality you're asking right now, but it does offer a little more than what kubectl get top pods offers right now. And if you think that this kind of functionality, is a higher level thing, perhaps we'd be happy to discuss how this could be added in Deepscope too.
And probably the last question for the day. We've had some people drop, and everyone kind of has to get back to work. So I'll go ahead and ask this one final question. Javi asks, we've got 2 nodes, production cluster in GKE 173, and we're suffering random restarts of the kubelet every day. We've had to look at dmessage, and they've looked at journal control for the kubelet, but we can't see anything relevant, just a kubelet service being restarted. 10 minutes ago, we saw one of the nodes was restarted, and all they see is the uptime has changed when they SSH into the node. How can they debug the situation? Is there any other log that they can look at other than dmessage and journal control to figure out how the kubelet is being restarted? I feel like we're in the dark and we can't keep our production app running with constant downtimes.
So I could try and take that, just a quick stab on that. I think essentially you want to monitor, start with, try to identify whether this problem actually occurs at very regular intervals, right? So if it does occur at very regular intervals, then you debug it in a certain way, you try to correlate it to other events. And one way to tell that could be this Prometheus. Prometheus has a generic up metric, and you'd be able to figure it out from there. You'd be looking at a particular job in Prometheus. I mean, I can happily explain that if you want to go down this path. and I could do so offline with them. And if it's not that, trying to relate all the logs you've got is probably a good thing, but maybe rather difficult. So if you can isolate the problem into, that's actually GKE. Is it GKE they said?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, right. Why? Right. So, I mean, if it's GKE, I guess, then, contacting some of the folks there would be a good idea because, in GKE, it's not like your own system. You don't really have full access to the thing that's been set up by the GKE provisioning system, right? So right. I'm not entirely sure if it's worth digging into unless Google can't help with this.
Yeah. I want to avoid having answers about cloud providers be contact your support rep. But it does seem strange that a service would restart like that. It might be one of those cases where you might want to leverage their expertise, as much as I would hate to say that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So also trying to run larger nodes be a start. So this could be just some kind of resource usage related bug, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they're saying N1 standard 2, so I think that's a pretty small one. If my memory serves me well.
Yeah. Thanks, Javi. Sorry we couldn't come up with an obvious answer to your question. All right, we're going to sneak in one more because MHZ here, question one in. Are there any plans to have PVCs that don't specify volume size so that the size of the volume is dynamically expanded as needed? I know this would rely heavily on cloud provider, but I can dream.
Sounds like magic.
So can we make it so you just geometrically increases the size of your bill? Is that?
I mean, one thing to consider perhaps is something like Amazon EFS. That would probably provide you that out of the box already if you manage to make it work. I've not used it myself, but in my understanding, EFS as a product essentially gives you storage that scales as you grow.
I've seen usage of NFS provisioner with EFS. So you could use NFS dynamic provisioner with EFS as a backend. But then the PV or the PVC wouldn't be dynamically sized.
Yep. And that was our last question. Liz and Andy had to drop, so thanks to them for joining, and thanks to our panel here, Clayton, Ilya, and Puha. Puya. Sorry. Yes. Very hard names, but we will figure this out. We've had a consistent about 50 people watching the stream the whole time, so not a bad start. I'd like to apologize again for the mix-up with the URL. We'll definitely get that. I have been consistently writing notes on how to make this smoother. So those of you listening, I'm at CastroJO on Twitter, or you can just ping me on Slack. I'm just JORGE on Slack. Any feedback that you had to make this smoother would really help. I know for sure that the spreadsheet of questions isn't going to work because only one person used it. So what we're thinking about doing is adding in something in the bot on the Kubernetes Slack that will allow you to, when someone gets stuck, they can just queue it up for the next office hours, and then we can do that. So thanks everyone for participating. If you are interested in helping, those of you that are listening, we need help gathering all the Slack URLs and putting them in the notes. Maybe perhaps doing some investigations when someone mentioned a project, grabbing what the URL is. So if you want to help me with that, I've got the document is open to everybody. We can always use more help with you retweeting, things like that. If you want to run one of these in your own time zone, please let me know. And I want to get in the mood, in the habit of maybe running these every other week or so. This one was kind of like a dry run, like an alpha API feature of Kubernetes. So the next one will be much smoother. And then I want to get it so that anybody could just run these and have the resources available that they need to get this to happen. So thanks, everybody. I hope some of you come back. If we didn't get to your question or you need more help, please construct this, or if you're doing a follow-up for something that helped you, Please feel free to come back the next time we'll do these. I'll go ahead and announce these on all the typical Kubernetes help channels and everything. So thank you very much for coming. Our wonderful host, do you have anything else to say?
Thank you, George. Thanks, everyone.
Right. Thanks, everyone. We really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Thanks,
that was really good.
Thanks, Booyah. All right.
Bye.